The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the March 2020 Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Journal Club podcast. We're happy to have you here today, and we're here on Facebook Live as well as recording this for later viewing in our archives. Just a introduction, of course, the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum. We are dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. We believe that it is the responsibility of emergency medical professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine pre-hospital emergency care. So, we partner at the PCRF with the National Association of EMS Educators to promote research literacy and to advance the science of EMS educational research. So here today with the PCRF Journal Club, we're going to take a closer look at some of the latest research happening in medical education. I'm Megan Corey. You can see if you're on Facebook or if you're watching this from your home. This is, we've got a nice panel today. We've got Dave Page, we've got Dr. Bill Toon, Mike Tagman, Lawrence Brown, Rob Terrio. We might have somebody else popping in too. Kim McKenna, I know, might join us at some point if she's not on already. And we are going to be reviewing a research study, but we're also going to be using this to launch off a good discussion of a very timely topic, as we all know. And this research study was sent to us by one of the PCRF associates. This was entitled, "Does Online Learning Work Better Than Offline Learning in Undergraduate Medical Education?" It was a systematic review and a meta-analysis, and this was in the journal Medical Education Online in 2019. This study came out of Beijing, China. So we've got selected this topic area for obvious reasons. All across the country, and all across the world, really, schools are at all levels have been closing face-to-face classes to halt the transmission of the virus that causes COVID-19. So we know that this has resulted in a forced shift for many to online learning and distance education to maintain what we're calling continuity of education. I think that's a great phrase, by the way, when I'm interested to hear how people are feeling about that new mantra of continuity of education. So we know this can be challenging for healthcare and for EMS programs for a number of reasons, and not the least of which is the need to teach and test hands-on skills and clinical decision-making and affective competencies. We can get into that, discussion as well. So we know that even just focusing on the cognitive domain, we've got a lot of skeptics. I'm sure Rob can outline some of that, since Rob, you've presented at as many conferences as I can remember. I remember watching you present when online was a new word. So you've been at this for a long time. And these authors cite several studies that suggest that online learning is at least as effective as offline, but the total effects were, maybe low, or maybe it was a weak comparison model. And they used maybe more advanced students, like, postgraduates or professionals, like in continuing education. So these authors really wanted to add knowledge and fill a gap using a targeted group that excludes postgraduates and professionals. And they wanted to know, how does online learning compare to offline learning for teaching and medical education knowledge and skills? And really, they were looking at the undergraduate medical education, because there's a core cognitive curriculum that they could look at. And this was a systematic review and a meta-analysis. The thing I liked about this was that they really wanted to focus, when they did their review of how they did their search, and they used the PICO criteria for inclusion, they only included, they really wanted to include sort of high quality. They used that Mirsky, quality indicator, and they wanted to really only include studies that looked at outcomes, not ones that evaluated things like opinions and experiences and, but how did I feel about online versus offline? Because, a lot of us know as educators that the student feedback is important, but a lot of times student feedback doesn't match what we know is better in terms of their learning outcomes. So that was one of the things that I thought was pretty good about the kind of thought behind the design of the study. So I don't know if everybody here had a chance to read through it, but this was 17 years of a database that they, or 17 years that they of research that they poured through from 2000 to 2017. They looked through, table of contents, did a search of common medical databases using standard search terms, and then they used the Mirsky quality tool, which somebody sent out. Bill, did you send that out by email to us? I think that's a really good tool. I think we did this at NEMC, our journal club live when we did at NEMC. We handed out that tool, the Mirsky tool, the medical education research quality index or indicator tool, to assess the quality of each study, and then the PICO criteria for inclusion, where you look at participants, interventions. What's the other C? And comparison, and then outcomes, and decided on their inclusion criteria. So, and then they did a data synthesis and did a meta-analysis on this. So we have somebody walk us through this. Is this what you're seeing right here? Then are these before we get to what they found, what they did. So this is your tool. Shows you their how they started their search and what they ended up with and how they excluded based on their PICO. Anybody want to take a crack at explaining the method here of you guys have done?
Lawrence is the most qualified.
Well, I was saying, yeah, and he's definitely going to be saved for the meta-analysis for sure.
I promised Lawrence that he would only have to do stats today because it was really short notice. So
it's okay. It's okay.
He's probably done the most systematic reviews here, right? Maybe you or Dave.
Yeah, I don't know. So they use the 5 databases that you see there in the upper left-hand box and search them using a variety of search terms that identify undergraduate medical students and online or not online, well, comparing online and not online education. One of the authors went through all of those articles just based on the title and said, okay, well, clearly this isn't relevant. And then 2 of them together went through the remaining ones, titles and abstracts, and ended up going through 3,700 papers, which is a lot of work. Now, a lot of those ended up being duplicates, ended up being papers that really weren't relevant to what they thought they were looking for or didn't have the inclusion criteria that they were looking for. After going through all of those, finding 67 full papers, they then read all 67 of those papers through that process and ended up with 16 papers that actually reported on what they were looking for. So is that what you were looking for, Megan? Or
yeah, exactly. And this is painstaking work too. When people think, oh, I'll do a systematic review because I don't have to, enroll subjects. I can just basically take other people's research. It's a lot easier. I can see you shaking your head. It's not easier, and I know Dave can attest to this too. It's painstaking to do this. So. And once they get down to the excluding, and this is pretty typical, you start with cast a wide net and then you kind of taper down. Once they excluded everyone after reviewing, abstracts and looking at articles, and then based on the full text of those 67 articles, they excluded what was it, 8 on full text missing, so some of them they weren't able to. And that brings up something we've talked about too. Can you even access some articles? And that's a sore spot with some of us, who would like to see more accessibility to articles. And then excluded based upon the screening of the full text, maybe after reading it saying, well, this one probably wasn't as relevant or didn't have the outcomes maybe we were looking for. Maybe it only used a Likert scale opinion piece or whatever. And then came down to the 16 articles. So then now we're seeing when you do a systematic review, then that we're going to see the quality indicators. So the first table shows the Mirsky results, and if I recall, I think the highest score you can get on a medical education quality score is 18. And they, these are the indicators or the domains of that survey or that item, the Mirsky item. So it's they look at the design of the study, the sampling, the type of data that are used, the validity of the instruments, and then the data analysis method that they used, and judged. Each one gets a score for the quality of each of those elements. And then finally the outcomes, which again, they emphasized they wanted intervention outcomes, not and objective assessment tools, not just the experience of the person, of the students. So overall, they had an average, I think, of 13.5 as the score, as the mean, I'm sorry, of the quality. And then you can see, just kind of scanning through the range of scores, there's some that were up at, I think the highest was 16, some in the 14 range, and then some, of the individual papers were, had some individual items that were low. Not a lot of multi-center stuff, so a lot of single center for obvious reasons. That would be very difficult. I can't imagine, unless it was an action research and we had sort of a team of people across the country or something that were doing the same thing. So not a lot of multi-center. And then what's the next one is the next slide, the bias, the risk of bias. Dave, can you advance that?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the risk of bias is the next one. Did you guys have any input on this tool on table 1? Yeah, because so the risk of bias, I think, is a really interesting one. I'm still kind of unclear on how you go about doing this, although I think conceptually I love this because it really takes into account, okay, when we're looking at a study, all the different things that can be introduced when you're doing a study in terms of your own biases, whether the study didn't use a good randomization scheme so that you select maybe subjects that would be more likely to go one way or another in your results. Same with how you whether or not you've blinded either the subjects or the researchers, or at some point to the outcomes, so that is there any sort of blinding issue, and then the outcome on the other end of it. Did you have attrition? Did you have a lot of poor follow-up, or did you selectively report your results? All of those things were assessed for each of these 16 studies, and you can see the results here. So which are the more common things too that you might see in terms of their bias. What I don't have a good firm grip on, that maybe somebody here does, is how did they determine this? How did they determine low versus unclear versus high risk of bias for each of the studies? Is there a score? Does anybody know?
So there's a tool from the Cochrane collaboration, and I believe that's what they used here. But ultimately, it's the reviewers, the authors, go through and score the paper against that tool. So there is still some subjectivity in there, but basically it'll ask, were participants randomized to the control or the intervention group, yes, no. And if that's a yes, that's a good score, and if it's no, it's bad. And so for each of those elements, there's that kind of scoring tool. Did that answer your question, though?
Yeah, I think so. Do we have any questions on that coming? Dave, are you monitoring any of the chat or question area?
Yes, we are, and I'm happy to report that there's many people online.
Yay!
So it's a fairly unbelievable response. I guess, but very believable if we're all in then self-quarantine. So I apologize for not being able to multitask better and make intelligent comments. We are monitoring questions. So if people have questions and want to put them in the chat room, that's one option. We also are able to unmute you and have you actually verbalize the question, which we would much rather, we'd prefer it, because today is an odd day. I think a lot of us have been cooped up for a while. I'm on day 13 of self-quarantine after a return from an International Paramedic Registry event in Ecuador. So I've been in that crazy mode of being locked up in one or two rooms, even isolated from my family, to make sure there's no problem. So today is a day to be together and to be able to communicate. So if you raise your hand, then we will know that you want to say something or ask something. And I see that Chadwick Massey is actually raising his hand, and we'll try and unmute him as we are able to. Chadwick, if you can now hear me, you're definitely off mute, and you can ask your question. Okay. Well, we'll keep working on the technical side of things. So there are no questions in the question area or the chat area for the moment.
And there might be as we move through and get to the results. Did I hear somebody try and get in there? Oh,
yes. So
yeah, Bill
I
too.
think that would be the good part, is let's continue to move through the paper fairly efficiently so we can really get to the questions, because we want the audience to not only hear the overall summary of this, but we really want to get their input about what they're dealing with now, and is it meaningful to them at all?
Good idea. So if you do want to see the ultimate, the nitty-gritty details of the risk of bias assessment too, there are multiple pages of highly detailed, evaluations of each of these elements of bias. But let's walk through these results. And Lawrence, this is where you shine. Help us understand these different things. So the first thing we have is the identified articles in the systematic review, and then we'll move into the meta-analysis.
Yeah, so they grouped the articles by what endpoint they measured, and the endpoints made sense. They compared, for most of them, they compared the post-test scores of the online group to the post-test scores of the control group. There were a couple of them, I think 3 maybe, where they had the change in score. So they had a pre-test score and a post-test, and they were able to look at the change in score. And then there was one paper that actually looked at retention of information at a later date, and I don't remember the time frame for that, whether it was a month or 3 months or something like that. But those are reasonable endpoints. And what they measured, and I don't know what the next slide is, so maybe David, if you can advance the slide, I'll make sure I'm saying the right thing, or not. Yeah. Measured is what they call the standardized mean difference. And I'm guessing maybe that's one of the reasons Megan asked me to do this. So if you imagine that I gave a test to my students that was a 100-point test, and there was a 20-point difference between the two groups. Okay. And then Mike Tagman gave his students a test that was only a 5-point test, but there was only a 1-point difference in his group. How do you compare those things? And this isn't the exact math, but the concept is, in Mike's group, a change from 4 to 5 is a 20% change. In my group, a change from 80 to 100 is a 20% change. So it's just a mathematical way of putting everybody's tests on the same scale. And so you can think about all of these outcomes as the percentage change within each group. That's not exactly what they did. They used the standard deviation, not the raw number, but it's the same idea. When you look at these forest plots, and that's what these charts are called, for those who haven't seen them before, the up and down line just means there's no difference between the two groups. The lines going across are the estimate of the effect. So there's a dot that shows exactly what they found in their study, and then the line shows the range for the 95% confidence interval, what it probably is out there in the whole great big world. And when that left to right or horizontal line touches the up and down line, statistically, that means there's no difference. When the left and right or horizontal line is to the right of the up and down line, it favors online learning. And if the entirety of the line is to the left of the up and down line, it favors offline learning. And what you can see here is There's a lot of variation in the effects. They don't all kind of line up with each other, and that's something we call heterogeneity. And they were able to test for that. If you want to read the really fine print down there in the footnotes, it'll give you a p-value for the heterogeneity. What it says is all of these studies are measuring somewhat different things. So they all measure online versus offline, but some of them looked at a 1-hour class. Some of them looked at a 3-week class. Some of them worked at a semester-long class. Some of them looked at skills, being able to describe a skill. Some of them tested knowledge. So even though they were the same outcome, they were measuring different aspects of that outcome. And that's what we call heterogeneity. And that just cautions us about combining all of these things together. We just have to be careful to remember that they're not all measuring the exact same thing. The upshot from this analysis, though, is if you look at all of these forest plots, either these two on this page, and I believe there's 1 or 2 more, what you see is there's great variation, but there's either no difference or it favors online learning. You won't see a single one of these, I don't think, where it says online learning is bad. So at a minimum, we can conclude from this that online learning is at least as good as offline learning in these circumstances. And for many of these studies, they found it was better.
And again, this is for undergraduate medical education
Right.
students in these selected studies.
Yeah, and again, I think a really important point here is some of these were just before and after a single lecture. Most of them were before and after a couple of hours or maybe a short session. I think only 1 or 2 of these were like a full semester's worth of work.
And I think that they also do a good job of in their discussion of explaining how, what's the word I'm looking for, how they may not be reflective of the bigger picture. You know, that at least in this case that they looked at, this is what they found. And I agree with you. It's that the biggest thing I think is the fact that it's at least equivalent, but they couldn't, and that while there was some that said better, there was such variation there that it's difficult to pin something down. And I think that as you read anything in higher education, particularly the Chronicle Higher Education has a whole lot of articles they talk about how do we measure the quality of online education as compared to what we think is traditional. And it just shows we have more work to do. That's really the bottom line, and find out what is the right sauce to get us to the point. Because I do feel that as we continue to go on in time, particularly, for example, like Mike's son, he's going to be educated entirely different than we were educated in the very traditional format. And we need to adapt and change. And this might be forcing us to do this right now, but hopefully it won't suddenly, when everything's done, we throw it all back and we go back to what we feel most comfortable with. That's the caution, I think, there with what we're going to be doing.
There's a phrase that Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, said that never let a good crisis go to waste. I think that captures what your message is there, Bill.
I'd like to hear from Rob a bit too about and because again, you've been around from the very beginning of online education and distance education, and one of the things I'd also like to talk about is how can online, we keep hearing from people how it's not the same and how it can not be the same as face-to-face, but that there might be an equity issue with online learning that maybe not everybody has access to, fill in the blank, but there's also an equity issue that we're missing where online learning actually might be favorable in some environments. Imagine someone who is not able to go to class, someone in a rural area, someone who is disabled, someone, there are other ways that online learning and social media platforms and things have brought people to the table that weren't traditionally able to go to the table too. So I'd like to hear from Rob, his experience.
Yeah, so I got an invite just late last night to this panel, and I've been on web conferences all morning this morning. Read the Reader's Digest version. But my question to the panel, to the rest of you guys, is Of these 16 studies, how many of those studies in how many of those studies were students randomized to either online or face-to-face? Because students tend to self-select for online learning, and so they tend to have a higher level of motivation and self-directed learning capabilities. So that would affect the outcome of the study as well, I suspect.
Absolutely, and I think that in a meta-analysis, it's hard. I think that's incorporated into the level of evidence, and so the better the evidence, the stronger the randomization, the stronger the numbers. So what's nice about a systematic review or a meta-analysis is trying to account for some of those outliers that are studies that might have sounded good with 10 students versus ranking the evidence and trying to then really just incorporate the best available, best I guess the stuff that's the secret sauce, the stuff that really actually says, yeah, okay, it's randomized, perhaps hard to blind this, but at least more controlled studies would rank higher. I also think your point is really interesting and good, which is that when people self-select to take a course like this, they would say, okay, I'd like to try this format. In the wake of COVID-19, there is no trying. It's all of our universities are shut. Maybe some are open, but the ones that I know of are all shut. My sons, 18, 17, 14, they're all going to finish their semester in some form of distance learning. And whether it's live online lectures or, at UCLA, we were forced to move the paramedic students who did not select this format were really kind of struck by, now I have to learn this way, but I have my kids behind me running around because they're off school and my wife is trying to work also. And so it's not a normal, I'm going to take my time, go into, my kids are at school and I'm going to do my work asynchronously. If we say everybody now just switch to online and all the things that are happening at home, all the distractions, all the rest of the life is actually causing this. So I know we have tons of experts on this webinar too that are in the audience, and I really want to hear from you because I think this is the forum to really share best practices. And I think this article gives us an excuse to say it does work, but maybe it works when students have a motivation to do it. I know my sons really hardly would even want to do a webinar. My son is Scout. He's a Scout leader, and this week the troop met online with a virtual Zoom meeting. But he really just could not wrap his brain around Scouting being virtual. It's just not the kind of thing that you do. And EMS is maybe that too. There's cognitive components to it, but there's also some psychomotor components and just some social components that say we hold people's hands, we talk to people. How do we do that? And how do you do that in such a way that you're not a little, post-it stamp image trying to assess some pillows, which might be possible, but splitting psychomotor to cognitive, I think a lot of these studies are based on the theory, the cognitive component of learning, and we have a great challenge. So we have great motivation. People need to be trained. If we're going to face a disaster of this size, a pandemic of this size, we have to graduate people. So we can't just stop teaching. Our wheel well, our swim lane is get some people trained, but we might have to do it just cognitively, and that it presents a challenge.
Yeah, I would challenge that myself, but go ahead, Bill.
Rob, would you do us a favor, since I've known you and first met you, you've been doing online, and I know now you're beginning to work even with virtual reality. So just explain how you've used online in your program there, because it touched on some of the things that Dave talked about, people coming from a distance, because I know some of your students travel an hour or even 90 minutes sometimes to get to class and stuff. And it'd be really good if you could talk about how long you've been, when did you first start doing it, and what are some of the real key things that you've learned?
Sure. So, the study looks at online learning in an asynchronous format, and with COVID-19, we're looking at a completely different format for online. Most educators who transition to online are doing either webcasts using a variety of webcasting tools, such as this one, or they're doing screencasts or a combination of those two things. And, having transition to a traditional asynchronous mode, and so had COVID come along between 2000 and 2010, colleges and universities would be in serious trouble. But somehow we've managed to transition to online, and so I did my undergraduate degree and my master's both online and in an asynchronous format. And it's, I knew even before I did my undergrad that it was a very sort of isolated experience, and I really felt many years ago that a synchronous component should always be included in online learning. So as early as 1999, I started teaching synchronously and asynchronously online, and I really went sort of full steam ahead in 2007 when we started running our advanced care paramedic programs. So I think it's important to have a little bit of that face-to-face and to facilitate students being able to meet face-to-face without their teacher, because even just to meet Maslow's hierarchy of needs, students need to connect with one another just to be able to talk about things like, did you understand that assignment, and to learn that other students are in the same boat. And I found that going through my master's online. So the transition to this is a good lesson for all of us educators going online, because it's going to give us for many of us, a new skill set, which is great. And, there's a challenge for teaching synchronously online. The quickest way to anesthetize your audience is to do a webcast and mute everyone and just give a lecture. The panel we're having right now is sort of necessary to do that, but you might as well, give some transdenim ketamine, because they're going to have a dissociative experience where, their eyes glaze open. They're just listening.
I love that.
So, you got to, for a synchronous online platform, you have to be able to engage them, and either using a polling function within the system you're using, or going to some external polling function so they're active, they're doing things with their hands, and you got to call them out and talk to them and unmute them, and that ideally happens in smaller groups. But the other thing that educators who transition to online can work towards is building a repertoire, or building a set of screencasts so that they can cover some of the core material in screencasts, and then do some case-based learning in a webinar in a synchronous online environment. So I think there's really no comparison with what we're doing now during COVID-19 to what the authors discussed in this paper.
I think that's really important, because we were talking before coming on, and without promoting products and whatever, I don't think anybody would disagree that Zoom has become one of our favorite platforms, and mostly because of the ability to do those Zoom rooms, those small rooms, the chat, the live features that, people are holding everything from meetings to virtual office hours to interactive classes where you can put people into small groups and study sessions in Zoom. So I think just the development over time is incredible. I think in this article they hit on something that I really would love everyone's input on, and that is, and something that Bill Toon talked about quite a bit, which is the training of faculty. We have a hard enough time in EMS setting the bar higher, frankly, for becoming professional educators in a classroom setting. And that is now going to be another layer that we really need to tackle when it comes to distance education. If we haven't already, and maybe, maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe you guys can tell me. We have the, the NEMC instructor course, and now we have a level 2. Now we have a skills instructor course. I think we're building things slowly, but we are pretty far off from the nursing model of requiring a master's degree before you are, a primary educator in nursing. So, and now, again, getting back to what Mike said, this is an opportunity. This is a huge opportunity. How can we grab it? And we have that, actually. I think it was one of the comments from Jerry Warlick about how do we see everything moving due to COVID-19. Will this cause a shift in EMS training to distance education, similar to nurse practitioner model, including labs and practical skills? So that's, one of the questions.
Wow, what a charged question. And I, there is a new normal here. We are in a totally unprecedented world event, and we cannot assume that it will not have long-standing impact on the way we teach. Even with master's degrees, I think people get thrust into online teaching without any preparation, any kind of, just because they have some preparation as a teacher does not mean that they ever were venturing into the virtual world. I do think that some of the work that Bill Young has done and an entire group of EMS educators working on flipped classroom to try and get some steps to self-directed learning, active learning. Chris Liebador has been a big advocate in our community about active learning and trying to get the student engaged in material as Rob said, without sort of just watching, talking head. And if there's active exercises, and we've done many webinars here on the usefulness of questions, right? So the process of critical thinking and sparking people to go dig for more information may be just as powerful or more powerful than content delivery, which frankly today with sources the way they are, we need to figure out which source is credible. The textbook has some very good pieces to it, as well as that can help. Yeah, Mike.
So I've been teaching grad school online for 23 years now, and I'm at 2 different universities. A couple of the things I've found when it comes to skill building and engagement. So for the actual hands-on, like intubation, IVs, and that kind of stuff, there are a number of medical schools and nursing schools that do most of their didactic content online and have people come in for labs to do the hands-on live part of the training rather than trying to do that part virtual. I found I teach mostly asynchronously. The vast majority of it has been asynchronous, and using a bit of a Socratic method where I'll do a little bit of content, 10 or 15 minute at the most video, and then a couple of questions, asynchronous threaded dialogue that everybody contributes to, and include asking questions. Go get you made a claim here, go get the science for it. And there's something about that collaboration, and the Institute for Healthcare Improvement is learn, and kind of using that framework seems to have built pretty engaging learning experiences, at least according to the people who've been part of the program over the years. So I just wanted to toss that part out.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, and so engagement is one thing. So how do we measure engagement, right? And because we know that the more engaged the student is, the more likely they are to have some type of positive outcome. And then it's the outcome. So that's another thing I think as a collective group of educator researchers, which I think educators should all be researchers, we should be thinking about those outcomes. So and we actually are. I would argue that educators are, because you've developed student learning outcomes at the very beginning, and then you have to evaluate them at the very end. So we're just not taking the next step and comparing them all across of our programs. But yeah, I think the next step is then what are the outcomes of those students.
I'm hoping that looking into the future a little bit, that COVID-19 is going to be the catalyst for some educators to start exploring virtual reality. Bill mentioned that earlier, and I'm currently on a 2-year secondment to help faculty and programs incorporate virtual and augmented reality into the curricula. And I think there's some incredible potential for experiential learning in virtual reality, not to replace the hands-on lab experience, but to reinforce the skills. Because when you're in VR and you have a certain level of agency where you're things, I'll give you an example. There's a great nursing VR application that teaches insulin administration. And basically in VR, you see your hands and your arms and you see a patient, and you're able to go through all the steps that you would need to do, including washing your hands for 20 seconds, and it actually has a timer. And then you're going to the equipment room and getting all the appropriate pieces of equipment, including IV bags and administration sets and so on. Then you're assembling it. Then you're speaking with the patient and looking at their armband and going through, the 5, 6, 7 rites of drug administration. And when you can do that repeatedly and you're using your hands and your brain simultaneously, that embodied cognition, I think, is very powerful, and can, one, reduce the learning curve, and two, dramatically improve the experience when you do get that hands-on in the lab. So VR is still early days, and I think, there are enough educators online here that hopefully some of them will join us and begin exploring what's available in VR and engage with the makers of these applications, because what I'm finding in certain VR applications is they've got some really interesting, compelling lessons, but some of the pedagogy needs to be tweaked or improved. I'll give an example. If I'm doing patient simulation in virtual reality, choosing the questions I'm going to ask the patient from a drop-down list, choosing the drug I'm going to administer from a drop-down list, and the dose from a drop-down list is not great pedagogy. The ideal would be voice recognition and artificial intelligence, where I can request those things, or better still, if I want to take a set of vital signs, I should be able to, or my partner should be able to, grab a pulse oximeter from the monitor, apply it on the finger, grab a blood pressure, apply it on the other arm, and the technology is there for that.
Of course, and we will see, I think we will see avatar-like, artificial environments in which you can be a virtual self. We've seen that with many attempts at, I forget the name of the virtual world that was created, so you could attend virtual class, and sort of Doug Godomsky introduced us at a NEMSI conference to that virtual world. I do want to, and I feel compelled to address this immediate, almost MacGyver-like environment in which many of us find ourselves today, where we won't have that virtual reality tool set up, and we do need our students to be able to do some skills. I've actually unmuted Katie O'Connor, who's been teaching at UCLA and teaching online, both in a scheduled web paramedic class long before COVID, but also be in our current nightmare of move everybody online right away. And she can pipe up. But we've been discussing the use of self-made videos. So post yourself on YouTube or get onto a Zoom meeting and show us that you can do an assessment on some pillows. or perform a skill, even if you have to, we have to drop off kits with equipment, hopefully cleaned and COVID free, that they can use to actually show us that they can do a manual skill, and somehow have the proctors of those virtual labs be able to observe the skill and the interaction, do a history, and at least some voice treatment, or some pillows set up for an assessment, some cardboard splints if you want to show how to do splinting. Because I don't foresee, I guess, we've been on telephone calls all week with people from Spain and Italy and France, and the crisis seems rather severe, and so I don't foresee the lack of need of healthcare providers in a hurry, and I see a whole lot of temporary certification or temporary permissions, because we have people who are halfway through courses, but we also have people who genuinely want help and might get on the job training if we can confirm their cognitive ability. And so as much as we can do online to say, do we have this, do we understand this, and of course verifying competency in terms of secure exams has been a very difficult question. But many of our people, at least the ones that are functional or within departments, they're volunteers, they do have the ability to be proctored and mentored by someone at their own station who's a trusted Confederate work related supervisor, and we might be able to get some higher level, higher stakes testing done for the cognitive ability. I would just caution educators not to unsecure their exams now, only to find out 6 months from now we don't have any exams that are really secure anymore, because everybody emailed them to each other. So alternative testing and temporary permissions may be what needs to happen here, and certainly some very creative MacGyver-like, show me how you can do this skill.
Katie O'Connor, I think, is on the line. Katie, can you hear us?
Yes, and I'm actually Facebook live streaming you guys, so I think a lot of people can hear you.
Great, Katie.
Cool.
Katie, can you? You've done a lot of online teaching, and you had a great comment about the learning curve for an instructor and how much an instructor learns.
Yeah, that's how I'm using Zoom right now to live stream you guys. I feel like I've lived inside of Zoom for the last couple of weeks. But the one thing that was really interesting that we found moving to these online, what we're calling skills, I was able to crowdsource through just Facebook connections and Twitter connections, and we now have instructors teaching in our program like Dr. Toon and Chris Kroboth from Fairfax County, and we have a paramedic from Canada working with us, and a midwife from New Jersey, that we would never be able to all get into like a skills room before we went to this online Zoom session. And we're using the monitor, the iSimulate monitor. So the students are actually having to do like, okay, I want someone to get vitals. And our facilitators are sending the vitals to just that team member. So they still have to use their team, and they have to wait, and we're doing it in real time. And we have these patients who students have never seen before. They're just coming in through the Zoom camera. And we found that without the distraction of all the cool stuff they would get to put their hands on and do, our critical thinking has gone up through the roof. We're doing all sorts of differential diagnosis discussions that we never would have done in a skills lab where we are focused on starting an IV and pulling up the meds. All things we'll have to do, but it's been this kind of fun surprise in learning.
Oh, tell me you're going to present this.
Yes, really.
Come on, Katie, present this.
Hi.
Lots of educators out here going, we want to see this. How did this work? We'd like to try it too.
Yeah, actually, Bill is writing it up. So not only has he volunteered to be in our class and teach, he's now also writing it up for me. So I'm just crowdsourcing all my work now.
Fantastic.
I love
Bill,
it.
do you have anything to add about that since you're part of this?
When she put her call out on Twitter or one of those places, I said, yeah, this would be interesting. I want to go out and try it and stuff. And so not knowing it, the learning curve was very short on how to get into Zoom. She broke us up into these classrooms. So I'm there as a patient. There's an instructor from the school who is the normal facilitator and keeps things moving. And I have 5 students in front of me and they all can see me. And I enjoy the opportunity to act. Shouldn't be any surprise. And but then they, the instructor takes the time after they work them through the whole scenario, and then they get to the point and says, okay, how did you feel? And they take them through a debrief. They go over, they highlight some specific questions they may have, and then it allows me to bring in then also my experience about what they did and where they may have, my tools from my experiences and stuff. And I believe at least I've done 2 classes right now, and I have 2 more to go. They seem very engaged. No one's sitting around. It's been very interesting to do it. And I've been just a patient. So I'm not teaching any of this stuff or any classroom type stuff. So mine is just interaction, like I'm in with a group. And I do think there's some value when you have people that can actually play the role well, but then also talk about their experiences. So there's some value to have models that are really knowledgeable about the profession and stuff. And she brought up the greatest thing in the world. You can bring in a variety of looking people. So you can actually have old people that have diseases. Like it was interesting when it came for men.
Hopefully they don't have COVID though. They're at home. They've got
yes.
like a virtual barrier to.
Yes. But I was able to use my actual medicine that I take. At this point, it's sad that I have medicines I had to take, but I use my medicines when they ask what meds you're on, and I use my actual medical history, and it seems much more genuine because I have it, so I have knowledge of it and everything, and so it's been very good. They've been very engaged. I'm looking forward to see how they do, though. This will be the key piece here is the people that are learning this way, do we see a difference? Was there some shortcoming from what they had? And again, I think Katie is still doing, along not only herself but all her team. They're doing this still on the fly. They're like everyone else. They had to turn this on overnight.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that's a big deal right there in and of itself. So
this might be
kudos.
Lawrence had something too. You had your hand up.
Bill, this might be a catalyst to form a group of elder paramedics to play act for
what a great idea.
A retirement gig.
I'd love to do that for my nursing home.
Right. Well, let's not go there. I hope people are getting the sort of that creativity bug that says let's try and figure out a different way of doing the jobs that we did. And I love the concept that in the middle of a social distancing crisis or there's an entire psychological effect, a negative effect on social isolation. And I think that being able to ask, especially older people who seem to be even more at risk and more socially isolated, although young people are as well, so let's not mince that or keep that stereotype going. The concept that we would use them from their home is really fun if they're able to. And I think Sahej Kelsa's on the chat here, and he's bringing up some really good points about the equity piece to this, which is really huge because some people don't have the connectivity that other people have. And so whether it's, your ability to pay for high-speed internet, which in some countries, like in Ecuador, they overnight said everybody has high-speed internet, the telecom must provide it, and they're going to provide it at the same speed, which really, if you think about, pipes of information, opening it up to everybody meant that everybody got very slow very quickly. Colombia, the same thing. So some people don't have the resources to do what we're doing right now, but wouldn't it be great if we can get them the technology and really try and address some of that equity.
That's the real opportunity. I think this proposes. This is the real opportunity, is to start addressing that, and to address that. And I think it's going to be forced because, and I think sometimes we say things like, you know, well, my students won't have, not all my students will have this, without really checking, because some of that gap is closing rapidly. And if you look at, I know I'm in San Francisco, the San Francisco Unified School District, a public school district. I went to one of their career and technical education showcases, and the students themselves had shown the instructor a free program on a smartphone that you could put into the, you know, the cardboard virtual reality kind of case. That I think there's, and these are not, this is not a, you know, a what do you want to call it? It's a school that's, these are public schools. So this was not something where you'd expect that everyone would have that. Also, everyone's heard of the rapid run to Best Buy and Costco and whatever to buy Chromebooks for students. That's a reality. I mean, that's what's happening. Thousands and thousands of Chromebooks disappearing from the shelves in the hands of educators to make sure students have them.
There's still there are some, we have to be concerned, I still think, about access, because I was amazed when I worked in Northern Virginia for a couple of years there, and we were trying to go to an online learning format or a learning management system. Half the county had no high-speed internet.
Yes.
And here you are just outside of DC, and it's an affluent county, and half of it didn't have access, limited cell phone service and stuff. And so boy, did I have a lot of complaints from that group of people. But the other thing is we have to make sure that we don't isolate people based upon their ethnicity or their culture as it relates to this, because I think that becomes another, while that can be harnessed, it'd be great to be able to get people of different ethnic backgrounds to be virtual patients, because it'd be great. Language barrier issues, having to work through that, be wonderful, but we have work to go.
Yeah,
sure.
we do. But, you know, I do want to make sure that everybody on the call and on this webinar, just kind of as we begin to wind down, I'm going to ask everybody to maybe give some final parting thoughts, just one or two takeaways. Like, but I think my takeaway will be, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We used to do correspondence courses, and even especially my inner city youth EMT class. And the class that I'm doing right now in Abu Dhabi, they may not have the fancy computer and the internet connection, but they do have some sort of phone, which even the simplest Lawrence Brown clamshell phone is going to be able to get on and off. Yeah, there you go. It's a relic, but it still works. It works really well. And even those allow for text messaging in and out of Facebook. So being able to give a class assignment, my son was still doing his homework, especially doing his homework without any live interaction from the St. Paul Public Schools. He was simply doing his homework with the textbook and the materials that were already baked in to the course. And I think that going back to sending an email or making sure that simple forms of communication, phone calls, that, you know, a conference call says, okay, we've gotten together, we're going to discuss this, but we just need you to do your homework. Relying on the learning management systems that already have a lot of the assessments in them, have the ebooks, but also the physical books that the students may have purchased, to not just, you know, I actually posted a link here on self-directed learning being an incredibly powerful and equal to in class, because self-directed does not necessarily need to mean live webinar via Zoom. It can mean get this accomplished in this timeline, and then here's your deadline to be able to, you know, take this assessment. So so that's my takeaway is we're stronger together. We need to share best practices, but don't forget that you're a great teacher even without all of the technology. And just because we're locked inside, that doesn't take away from great teachers. Use what you have, right?
I think those are great closing words. How about Lawrence? You got any final thoughts? We haven't heard as much from you.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting discussion. I want to tie this back. I'm going to research geek out a bit and tie it back to two questions that were raised in the chat because it's important. And they were about how articles get selected and whether or not we talked about students self-selecting to groups, whether or not educators who were doing these studies had some stake in the outcome. And what I'm trying to get at is the idea that there are probably not any publications out there of absolute failures of online education, not because they don't happen, but because we don't share our absolute failures. And as important as it is for all of us, Katie and everybody, to share all the things that we're doing that are working out great, it is also important for us to share the things that crash and burn, so the rest of us don't waste resources having that our experience ourselves. So I would encourage you to publish it if you crash and burn, but at least share it so that we're not all recreating the same mistakes.
Love it.
Rob, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly in summary, I would say if you're going to use a webcasting platform like this, you want to try to make it engaging. If you're going to use screencasting, you want to make it engaging, so not just video, but video combined with quizzes. And there are a number of different programs that will allow you to embed quizzes in the screencasting. If you're able to do case-based learning online, I think that's always a great approach. And finally, if anyone's interested in exploring virtual reality and where that's going in the future, feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks, Rob. Mike? Oh, Mike's meditating.
Oh.
Oh, he froze.
He froze.
How about Bill? You got anything? Any final thoughts?
Oh, he's on mute.
He's on mute.
Our platform
Here I
is
am.
telling us it's time. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So very good discussion. I always enjoy the opportunity to get together. I do want to hear, someone asked about a forum to talk on. I saw a note about that, and I believe right now that NEMSI is sponsoring a forum right now to try to help educators answer some of these questions and share some of this information. So if you go to the NEMSI website, you'll be able to find that. Certainly reaching out to anyone you know, but I really like that failure piece. I think that's so critically important that Lawrence brought that up.
Lawrence is brilliant. He's always brilliant. That's great.
Well, I worked when I was working in Northern Virginia. I was very fortunate to have a good group of instructors, and what I tried to get them to do is, let's do things different. And if it doesn't work, we learn and we do something different the next time. It's okay to constantly be trying to do something different and experiment and find out what really works well. And if it doesn't work well, then we move on. There's too much of our society that's based on perfection and not the opportunity that failure brings to learning, and I know I've got taking care of patients. I got plenty of years of making mistakes as I've learned.
Mike, you got a soundbite for us?
Yeah.
I have one quick one, just that the faster our industry can get over the notion that online education is the crappier version of classroom education, and start really exploring and playing with the gifts and benefits that are inherent and possible in online education, the better off we'll be in the long run and the short run.
Great. Brenda Maloney and Steve Scanlon are both educators out there calling for a community of educators to have more of this, especially at this time. I think it's time to answer that call at multiple levels. So any community sharing that we can do, we'll try and be on board with that too. Dave, And we've skipped the abstract deadline slide. Did you want to make any quick announcement about the abstract deadline?
The abstract deadline, I think, is in flux.
Okay.
We just heard today that NAMSE has canceled the conference where we were going to present these abstracts.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it's an odd time. I'd say a great opportunity for research, obviously. So track everything you're doing. It might be difficult to get IRB approval right now, but at least track the data and then retrospectively review it. And I'd say we need to reevaluate, and these forums, I think, are good. We will try and do as many as we can. I know NAEMT and our sponsor FISDAP is struggling with how and when and where, and we will continue to get together and hopefully analyze the evidence and help people through a time of unprecedented, historic, epic proportions.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll have more to follow on that, and more to follow on creating a community, a collaborative community of practice. Remember, this is also an opportunity for research, so on a number of levels, and we know we've seen that so far with ESO and their dashboard, and I hope educators will join in this as well. So thanks for joining us. We will, at least you'll know, we'll be back here Friday, April 24th for another education research podcast. Please go ahead and send us some ideas if you have some things you would like to review. If you see a research article, go ahead and email Dave Page, dpage@emsed.net. And remember, we'll be back sooner than that with a clinical podcast, and that will be on Monday, April 13th. And it's a pre-hospital care research forum. Thank you to everybody for joining. And Katie, awesome work, and keep it up and keep collaborating. See you soon.
Hi.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.